Welcome to the third session of OAuth with Access Manager. From this session, we are going to start with different authorization grant which the OAuth provides. Uh, when I say grant is basically a method to acquire an access token. What is an access token? An access token is a kind of a restricted keys which provide authorization to the user. Uh, we will have a separate session on different kind of tokens, but for the time being, just understand that a grant means a method to acquire an access token, and that access token is required to access a resource. In this session, we are going to talk about one of the grant which is called the Authorization Code Grant. Okay, uh, Authorization Code Grant, to understand what uh, are the different grants available with Access Manager or Access Manager supports, you can go to the documentation page, and there you need to go to administration guide and go to appendix. It has very good documentation. So the documentation here, if you if you see, there is a link OAuth Concepts, click on that. Here you can read about all the concept about the OAuth. So I really recommend you to go through this document because this will make your basic very clear with respect to the understanding OAuth and how the OAuth works with the Access Manager. So if you click on the OAuth terminology, you will basically, you can read about the different kind of OAuth roles, what are the OAuth credentials, and different tokens are available. We are going to talk about these in a separate session. Uh, Also here, there is a link about the OAuth Authorization Grant. If you click on this, you can see about the different grants. So Access Manager supports these different grants. We will have a separate session for each of these grant, and in this session we are going to work with the grant called Authorization Code Grant. But this documentation is very helpful to understand the OAuth concepts. Before we begin with the authorization code grant, uh, we we will go through just the basic concept of what all the different entities involved in the OAuth interaction, or you can say that who are the different OAuth actors. Let's take an example of this use case. So there is a guy Manjeet. He uses print my pic application, which is developed by one company called Happy Print. Happy Print basically develops application related to the printing images or pictures, and it uses to print his vacation picture which he recently uploaded to Facebook. So the use case is Manjeet uses Print My Pic application developed by company Happy Print to print his vacation picture which he recently uploaded to Facebook. So in this use case, if I ask who is the resource owner, so before that we probably need to also look what is the resource here. So what is the resource here? So resource is nothing but the picture. Resource owner. Who is the resource owner? Manjeet. resource server, where are exactly these pictures are kept. So these pictures are placed at Facebook. So Facebook is the resource server. Client, what is the client here? Print my pic application is the client. Authorization server. We did not talk about the full flow of the authorization code grant, but the authorization server, you can say the server who is going to give the access token. So authorization server is Facebook. We are going to visit this use case again once we use the LetsOAuth tool to get the access token from Access Manager. So this particular grant, which is called Authorization Code Grant, this is best suited for the client application which is hosted on a secure server, so that the user can use the browser to access this particular application and get the access token and everything, and it can use to do the get the access token and access the resources. Uh, if you have noticed the LetsOAuth tool, this is basically running on a secure server. Secure server means HTTPS protected, and it is basically running on a Tomcat web container as a web application. So you can say that this particular client is suited to use authorization code grant. So basically, authorization code grant is a two-step process. Uh, the first step is client application gets the something called code from Access Manager or any authorization server. Uh, Getting the access code includes two another steps. The first step is user need to log in to the IDP server, and also user need to provide the consent. Once these two steps are over, the client application gets the access code. The second step is client application exchange the code with access token. So once the code is with the client application, it will send that code to the identity server, and identity server will provide access token. Once the access token is with the client application can use that token to access resources. Now what we are going to do, we will use the tool LetsOAuth to visit the authorization code grant, how it works. Before doing that, we will quickly jump to the admin console and verify our client application. So we have created one client application for LetsOAuth application. And if we go and see the contents of that client application, you can view here. So you can see that it has a client ID, it has a client secret, it has a name, what is the type of the client, what is the redirect URI, and grants required. So this is important. If you want to use the authorization code grant, you need to make sure that you are at least enable the authorization code grants. Token type, these are also important. When you are going to use the authorization code grant, you are basically going to get a code from from identity server, and you will exchange it for the access token. So make sure that these two things are enabled. go to global settings and make sure that you have enabled the course domain as allow all. What is the course domain and why it is required, that we will check in next sessions. But for the time being, just enable the course domain as allow all. And here if you see, it says something like authorization code timeout. So this is a timeout which is associated with the authorization code, and access token timeout, this is associated with the access token. So in this use case, we are going to talk about the authorization code and the author access token. So these two timeout will be involved. So your code timeout is the 3 minute and the access token timeout is 60 minutes. After that, this token expires. The one thing I want to show you, if you go to your client application, you can see there is something called token configuration. If you click on this token configuration, you can basically see the timeout for the authorization code and the access token is 0 minute. If it is 0 minute, that doesn't mean that timeout is 0 minute. That means that you have not specified a specific timeout to this particular client application. So if it is 0 minutes, that means the timeout it is going to take from the global settings. So if you want the authorization code timeout to something else like 5 minutes or 6 minutes for this particular client application, you need to go and edit this value. Okay. So as we are going to work with this particular client application, it will be good if we just copy this information somewhere. Let's copy this in this notepad so that we can use this information. Now we are going to access the tool LetsOAuth. And you can see something like this here. So in this UI, you can see there are two things here like get authorization code flow step 1, get authorization token using code authorization code flow step 2. So as I said that authorization code grant flow is a two-step process. So the first step is to get the code and the second step to get the token using code. To explore the authorization code grant, we need a resource server. So by default, there is a resource server installed on the Access Manager. You can create your own resource server, but in this session, I'm going to use the resource server, which is default. So the resource server name is the identity provider. So if you go inside the resource server, you will see something called scopes. Click on this and here you will see the various scopes are there. Okay, so we are going to take the scope like profile and the email. So we are going to use two scopes. These are again the default scopes. You can create your own scope, which we will discuss in another session. So default profile and email. The user which we are going to use is the user we created in the very first session. This is OAuth test user. OAuth user. This user we are going to use. So we will see the first step to get the authorization code. So if you click on this link, you will see that a form appears here. Okay, so this form basically says what all things are required in order to get the code from Access Manager. If I go and see the source of this page, what it does, it takes these value from user and post this value to something called authorization code endpoint. So if you go and check the OpenID metadata endpoint, here you can see the authorization endpoint, and it is this endpoint here. So how do you know that what all different values are required here? So to know that, what you can do, you can basically go to the Access Manager documentation. And there you need to go to the section developer documentation. Use the document OAuth and OpenID connector developer guide. Click in this. Here you can see available endpoints. Click on this, and here you can see the different endpoints and what all different value this endpoint requires. So click on this one. Here you can see the requested parameters. So these are the parameter which is required to provide you either the code or the token. Oh, this particular is to get the authorization code. So the similarly you can basically get all the option which can be used. So here the parameter names are this side. There is field called required, so it says whether these fields are mandatory or not. So the mandatory parameter are must to send, but there are some optional parameter which you can just keep it to just test the different options which this particular endpoint provides. So this documentation you are going to use when you planning to write your own OAuth client, or you want to use the Postman or the curl script or LetsOAuth, or if you want to change the if you want to change this form and put some other options over there, then you can use that particular documentation. Okay, so in short, it is just a form. It creates a form and sends this particular information to the authorization endpoint. Okay, so now we are going to access this. So we have the information about the client ID. Go ahead and take the client ID from here. Response type is already there with the tool. You need not to change this. So the response type for the authorization code is code. Just keep it as it is. Resource server, there is a default one, which is the identity provider. We're going to select this. Redirect URI, scope. So we decided to take the scope profile and email. So if you're going to use a single scope, just keep it like that. But if you're planning to use more than one scope, you need to use a plus sign. So I will keep plus sign and email. State. See what is the state. State, this is a recommended option. It says an opaque value used by the client to maintain state between the request and callback. The authorization server includes this value when redirecting the user agent back to the client. The parameter should be used to prevent cross-site forgery request. So if the client application will send this particular state, what Access Manager will do, it will use that state, and when it sends the token back, it will send the same state information to the client, so that client can verify that the the state is same before and after. So I will go and just give some state. For example, auth code state. There are two other value, ACR, response mode. These are the option value. I will just keep it like this. We will talk about this later. And then what you need to do, you need to send this request. When you click on the send button, it is going to send all this information to the authorization code endpoint. So go and click send. So you can see it's a standard access manager page, and there is a contract executed here. Okay, what is this contract basically? So this is the contract which is assigned as the default contract. Name password form. Let's go and use our user, OAuth user, and the password. So before that, if you see this OAuth user, we have created one attribute for this OAuth user in the very first session. We have created the attribute called nidsOAuthGrant, but that attribute is not filled here. That's why it is not showing. So what we are going to do, we are going to use this user now, and when we sign in, you can see there is a page came here, and this page is called the consent page. This page is thrown by the authorization server, which asks you to provide the consent. As this consent is coming to the user directly, OAuth user has used the browser and he has given his username password, and this page came to the user. The user has to provide the consent. So what you can see here, the thing which you need to check, email address, this is the consent you cannot uncheck. So this is the mandatory consent you need to give. Basic profile, you can basically check or uncheck it. Okay, so when you do the access your email address, using this contains the minimum the email address need to be accessible, and the rest thing is optional whether you want to select it or not. Okay, so I will keep it as it is, and I will click on accept. When I click on accept, you can see it has sent the code on the page redirect URI OAuth response.jsp, and here you can see the values. Code, this is the code. It is basically a binary code. Format is binary of this code. all the OAuth code is the binary. So let's put the code value here. I'm gonna copy this. And you can see a state is the auth code state. So this is the same thing returned by the web server. So web server, I mean to say the access manager. So the client basically can verify if it is coming something other than that, that means it may be some kind of cross-site scripting attack has happened. So this can be, that kind of code can be discarded. So now you can see I got the state, auth got a state, the scope is the scope we asked for. Okay, now we have the code, so quickly we need to take the access token using this code. As you remember, the token time, the code time for this was 3 minutes. So we need to perform the operation within 3 minutes. So let's go to the, we have code, we are going to close this and we'll close this one. We'll use the second step. Click on this and you can see the different, this thing. If you're going to see the source of this, it is the same thing. You can use the document to read about it. So let's go and click here, and what we'll do, we will use this code and paste it here under the authorization on the code. Client ID, we will take this client ID, put here, take the client secret, resource server, you need to give the same resource server you used for the code, and the redirect URI. Okay, so this is the information we are going to send to another endpoint, which is called the token endpoint. You can see token. So let's go and click on this button, send, and you will get something like this over here. Okay, so you are getting values, which is access token. You are getting the token type, you are getting the expires. So it's going to expires after 3599 seconds. You are seeing the scope. These are the scopes we ask for when we ask for the code. The important thing, we got the token. So what we will do, we will take this token and copy it. Okay, so now we have the token with us. Let's see what happens if we use the same code once again. So go to get access token using code and go and put your client secret, client ID, resource server, redirect URI, and the code. This is the same code which we have already used. And let's see what happens if we use this code again. So it says that invalid client and input credentials are not valid. So that means there was something wrong with the code, and it did not give you the actual token here. It blocked the access to the token. So we have basically used LetsOAuth to get the code. We also saw that how to get the token using code. The last step what we are going to do is to verify the user. So you remember that in the beginning we discussed that the user uh, has an attribute called nidsOAuthGrant, which was not populated. I'll just go ahead and reload this entry, and now I can see the nidsOAuthGrant is populated with some values. Let's go and see what does it contain. So you can basically see that it says that about the cluster ID, URL, it says the client ID. So it looks like this user has used this client application, and it talks about the grant name, which is email, and the profile. So basically the scopes. So this is basically the consent which the user has provided. So the user consent is stored in this particular attribute. There are no other values because we are just getting the access token. Uh, there are some other value stored in this which we are going to discuss. Those tokens are called refresh token. We will talk about it. But uh, if you uh, if you don't use the refresh token, it's going to store the consent information, and that you can come and see here. So I think this is the end of this session. In the next session, we will see how we can use the token, the access token which we received to get the information about this user. What is the token info endpoint, user info endpoint, token introspection endpoint, and also we will see the different logs with related to getting the code and getting the token. Thank you.